NEXUS is an EU-funded project striving to make inclusivity a reality in the world of research and innovation. The project focuses on developing inclusive gender equality plans that span both in intersectional and intersectoral dimensions in 9 universities and in research organizations across Europe.
Today we have with us Londa Schiebinger. She is John L. Hinds Professor of History of Science at Stanford University and Director of EU-US Gendered Innovation in Science, Health and Medicine, Engineering and Environment. She earned her PhD from Harvard University in 1984, a leading authority on gender and intersectionality in science, technology, and medicine. Her work explores women's participation in science, gender in scientific institutions, and gendering of knowledge. Hi, Londa. Welcome to Nexus Project podcast.
Yes, thank you. It's nice to be here.
Thank you for joining us today. And we would like to ask you several questions. What inspired you to focus on intersection of gender science and innovation, and how has this field evolved over years?
Okay, so that's an interesting, good question. So I was in graduate school in the 1980s at Harvard, and there were no women professors in the history department except for one. And she was in Middle Eastern studies, not interested in women or anything like that. So there was no women's history taught at that time. There was no gender history taught at that time. And so I had a Fulbright to Berlin, and I think it was being away from Harvard and kind of getting into the women's movement in Berlin that allowed me to give myself permission to dump my current PhD thesis, which is kind of hard to do, and start a new one. So I started looking at women in the scientific revolution. So if you know anything about the history of science, the scientific revolution in the 17th century is the big deal, right? You have Galileo and Francis Bacon and Newton. So you have all these men as the narrative of that history. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? What were women doing? Excuse me.
Yes, indeed.
And so what were women doing, and how did they get excluded from science, which is supposed to be neutral and objective? So I started out and I found that there were quite a few women interested in science in the 17th and 18th century. So when this revolution was going on. But then by the time you get to the 19th century, when science moves into the university system, suddenly there are 0 women scientists working in a university context. So I took that to be my problematic, and I wanted to explain that. And so that's what I did. And, you know, I look at gender and science in 3 different ways. And I call them the 3 fixes. So the first one is to fix the number of women in science. How can we bring in more women so we have equity in participation? The second fix is to fix the institutions. We know that a lot of women might want to be scientists, but they get to these institutions that were formed around men's lives, and suddenly women don't fit. It doesn't fit to have children. It doesn't fit to, you know, a lot of the things women are accustomed to. We don't fit so well in the universities. So you have to reform the universities. That was a big deal in the 2000s. The US NSF had a whole program called the Advanced Program designed to make universities better fit women, to get more women into science. And then the third fix is the one I do, and that is fix the knowledge. And so as part of my doctoral dissertation, and my second book, which won a big prize, I was very happy about that. That one's called Nature's Body. I looked at exactly how science, which is supposed to be neutral and objective, embedded gender bias. And I took the example of Carl Linnaeus, who is the father of modern taxonomy. And I was really interested in in some of his taxonomy, he coined the term mammalia. You know, we humans are called mammals. So there's a whole
Yeah.
class of animals called mammals. And it's funny because I had just had my first child and I was breastfeeding. So I was really feeling like a mammal. But then I found that the guy right before Linnaeus had called us quadrupeds. And then I found that for at least 2,000 years, humans had been known as quadrupeds, so four-footed animals. But suddenly Linnaeus calls us mammals. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. So I looked into the politics of that, and the job that this term, mammals, mammalia, does in taxonomy is to link human to the other animals in that class. So it emphasizes that we are naturally animals, and he used the female breast to do that work. Now, when he wants to distinguish humans from all the other animals, he coined the term Homo sapien. So
Mm,
the man of wisdom, right? So it's
yeah.
a female trait. You can see the problem here. It's the female trait that connects humans to other animals, and it's the man of wisdom. So reason, intellect that separates, um, you know, humans from the other animals. So I did a whole book of very specific historical examples like that, and it was really fun, as you can tell.
Yes.
So so now I'm coming to how I morphed this. So that all focused on bias and exclusion. But I like to, if there's a problem, I always like to give a solution. I like to spark people's positive imagination to bring us to a new and better place. So about the year 2000, universities and funding agencies like the European Commission got really interested in getting more women into science, so in the participation thing. And I was invited to do a lot of talks because I had then published a new book that was that was on that. So I was giving these talks, but you can't go into a room of 500 scientists and tell them exactly how they are biased. They shut down. They do, obviously. I mean, obviously. So I developed this term, gendered innovations. I coined it in 2005 and really started the project in 2009 because now when I walk into a room of scientists, I'm asking them to collaborate with me to find the innovations. So, yes, we talk about the particular bias in a science, but then we look for the solution. And I find that this is very welcoming and you know it's very important. So
Collaborative.
the question there is if we use gender analysis, what discoveries can we make in science and what innovations can we make in technology? So everybody's on board. We love
Yeah.
discovery and innovation.
You got the right approach.
Yes, yes. So that was a fun thing. So I was very pleased because the European Commission immediately saw the value of this and they supported us to do expert groups. I learned about these expert groups from the European Commission, and we use that as our basic way of preparing. So anybody can go to our website, genderedinnovations.stanford.edu, and there we have many case studies, which are the examples of how gender analysis or intersectional analysis or sex analysis can bring us to new discoveries. So I was very pleased. The European Commission supported us and the US National Science Foundation. So this is all extremely important because doing research wrong costs lives and money. And so about the time I was developing gendered innovations, the US government had done a big study. This came out in 2001. It was extremely influential and made people want to know what is wrong with the research process that is harming especially women. And this study was that they found that 10 drugs, so 10 medications, were withdrawn from the US market between the years, so this came out in 2021, between the years of 1997 and 2000, and they found that 8 of those drugs were more dangerous for women. So not only did these drugs cost billions of dollars for the US to develop, but when they failed, they caused death and human suffering. So we really can't get the research wrong. But now we have a new measure. This just came out about a month ago. We have a new measure of how doing research right saves lives and money. So this study is from WHAM. Oh dear, what does WHAM stand for? Women's Health Association. I'm sorry, WHAM and McKinsey, which is the analytical group. And so this study shows that for the US, if we take heart disease, so heart disease is the number one killer of everybody, not just men, but also women. So a new study shows that improving women's heart health could add 1.6 million quality life years for women. So meaning women will have a better quality of life for longer, and it would it would save the US economy about $28 billion annually by the year 2040. And they also found that the same is true for autoimmune disease and Alzheimer's disease. So they're saying if you invest in women's health, you get big benefits in terms of keeping women alive and comfortable, and also not losing their work. So if women are healthy, they can continue to work and contribute to the economy. And they don't need care. They're not a burden, by needing care. So this is adding money also to the US economy. So very important.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, I was about to ask you a second question, but you already answered. It was about example, and you did a perfect example that is nowadays already a tradition to give the most convincing example of drugs. That
But we have other examples. I have
please do.
Okay. So, so heart disease is important, and so that was going to be my first example. And I think everybody knows across the US, people tend to know this, and across Europe, now they know that the symptoms of heart attack for men and women are different. So that's one of the big gendered innovations we've had in the last, I don't know, 15 years or so, that we understand that, okay, men get chest pain. It's the classic signs of heart attack. But women, they have like an upset stomach, they're fatigued. It's not a glaring sign of heart attack. So even the women themselves don't know they're having a heart attack. And if they call up the emergency service, which in the US is 911, the person on the phone doesn't hear, oh, I hear the symptoms of a heart attack. So what was happening before we had this knowledge is that women got to the emergency room 15 minutes later on average than men. And every minute in a heart attack really matters, right? So this is a huge gendered innovation that people understand that, and I think this is common knowledge now, that men and women have different symptoms of heart attack. Right. Now we can go beyond health, and I wonder how many of your listeners know the example of the crash test dummies. What do you think?
I am not sure exactly, because our audience is permanently growing. So please do share it as well.
Okay. So when we have car crashes, women are 47% more likely than men to be injured, even if we control for body weight and body mass. That's amazing. So even in a small car crash, let's say 56 kilometers per hour, a small one, women are much more injured than men. So why is that? So the crash test dummies are used by manufacturers to test the safety of their cars. So you can watch these videos online. They put a crash test dummy with lots of sensors in the car seats, and then they crash the car against the wall, and then they can study how the body is damaged. But these crash test dummies have been modeled on mid-size men's bodies all of these years, from the 1960s until 2022. So here's our big gendered innovation. So Astrid Linder, who is a marvelous Swedish engineer, I've met her so many times over the years because we work on these kinds of innovations. So she developed a mid-size female crash dummy in 2022. And what's interesting about this dummy is, so car manufacturers had little tiny female dummies for many years, but they didn't model the female body. The female body has different muscle strength and different ligament alignment. Women have different spinal alignments than men. There's a different body mass distribution in body parts for men and women. I mean, we have different, we carry yeah, we carry weight in different parts of the body. So all of this is important in an automobile crash. And Astra Linder, again in Sweden, was able to model all of that so that her crash test dummy really tells you what happens to the female body when there's a car crash. So now we have the technology, but we need a policy innovation.
Exactly.
We need the National Highway Safety Traffic Administration in the US and in Europe. So the government agencies that look at highway safety, we need them to implement, to require the use of these dummies. So if any of you know your governmental officials, this is
Yes.
something that you could ask for.
Definitely we will do, because we are connected at your access with supporting national government and other authorities in policies. So definitely we will do.
Yeah, and I want to give one last example from AI because everybody's so interested in that
Yeah,
now, if I
yeah,
may.
thank you.
Okay, so this one is on intersectionality. So far, I've talked about really mostly sex differences because the drugs are about how biological differences in men and women's bodies metabolize drugs differently. And the crash test dummy is obviously about body size and weight, right? So it's really about sex differences, not even gender differences. But now I want to give an example of an intersectional analysis. So intersectionality looks at all the forms of discrimination that there may be in a society. It's not just sex and gender, but also perhaps ethnicity. Age is an important factor we should look at, socioeconomic status, sexuality, geographic location. So all of these can be factors that we need to take account of in order to create AI systems or any systems that work for everybody. So the goal of gendered innovation, or we might even call it intersectional innovations, is to make technology and science work for everyone across the globe, right? So
Right.
most of these funding agencies, like the European Commission, are using public tax dollars to fund science. And if it's public tax dollars, those monies should be benefiting everyone, right?
Exactly.
Men, women of any race or background. So let me give you an example from facial recognition. Now, you all know facial recognition because if you have any kind
Right.
of smartphone, you use it to open your phone,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
And it's used a lot by security agencies. And I notice that now when I'm crossing international borders, they're just looking at my face. They're not looking at my passport anymore. So,
Mhm.
if
They
you want to
use,
get where
yeah,
you're
they use
get where you're
technology.
going, yeah, you need to know. So this is interesting because Joy Buolamwini, who was a graduate student at MIT, maybe about 5 years back, she was developing a facial recognition system, and she herself is a beautiful Black woman, and she could see that the system she herself was developing could not see her face until she put on a white mask. So she said to herself, okay, there's a problem here. So she shifted away from the technology to do a gender and race analysis. So this intersectional approach for her is looking at both gender and skin tone. So she did the gender analysis and found that facial recognition systems perform better on men's faces than on women's faces. Okay, if she stopped there, she would have had half of the story. She then did a skin tone analysis and found that systems perform better on lighter skin than on darker skin. But then when you do the intersection of those two analyses, she found that the system performed worst for women with darker skin. So the error rate of the system for women with darker skin was 35%. That's not really acceptable. So if women with darker skin are going through international borders, it's not going to recognize them 35%, no good. Then she found that for darker skinned men, it was about 12%, still not very good. For lighter skinned women, the error rate was about 7%. And guess who had no error rate? Yeah, lighter skinned men, because they had used themselves as the models for the system. So we're back to this default male that is very often used, right? So Joy Buolamwini and her co-authors were interested in an innovation, in a solution. So what they did was to create a more inclusive data set. When we get to AI, mostly the problem is in the data sets, right? So she created a data set from the faces of men and women with darker and lighter skin, and three of those groups were from Africa, so darker skin, and three were from Europe, lighter skin. So she made a more inclusive data set, and her work was picked up by the technology companies, some of the big companies here on the West Coast of the US, so here in California. And they improved their facial recognition system. So it was very clever of her to find a way
to do it.
Yeah. So she tested all of their systems and showed them, and they were quite impressed, and they picked up, her innovation. So I think that's just really great.
Okay,
So
thank
those
you
are my
very much for
examples.
those examples. They are really very interesting and very convincing that innovation could be done only considering gender equality and other intersectional data and details.
Hmm.
Now, what challenges do researchers and institutions face when trying to integrate intersectional frameworks into their scientific methods?
Okay, so this is a very short answer. The challenge that most scientists and engineers face is the lack of knowledge. And this is because all this gender and intersectional stuff is taught over in the humanities and social sciences. So natural scientists, medical researchers, and engineers don't have this in their core curriculum. So the required courses, right? And so
Yeah.
this is something that we're working on. There's a movement in the United States. I didn't start it. It started at Harvard to do something called embedded ethics, which is to teach the technical um, the technical skills in computer science, but at the same time to teach social analysis so the computer scientists can consider what will be the impact of my work. Can I avoid making the mistake like facial recognition? They made the mistake. They didn't have to. You don't have to launch a product and then pull it back because you've forgotten to look at gender and that sort of thing. So that's what we need to do is we need to overcome this lack of knowledge. And in a way, my whole Gendered Innovations project is an interim bridge for that because people who don't have this in their professional training can learn from the Gendered Innovations website, but we need a more basic fix, and that is to get this into the university curriculum.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have two more questions for you. The last one is, how can universities and especially the funding bodies support the widespread adoption of gendered innovation and inclusive research practices?
Yeah, so policy, so funding agencies, policies, and universities, policy can be a driver of innovation. So we need to think of these three pillars of science infrastructure. We published on this in 2019 in Nature, and also in Science. So we need coordinated policies for funding agencies, peer-reviewed journals, and universities. So funding agencies are first. They're at the beginning of the research process, and they can have requirements that if you are applying for public money, you have to promote research that works for everyone. So the EU has been a huge leader in this area. They've had policies since, oh, I don't know, 2003, maybe it starts, 2010 for sure. And in the last Horizon Europe, the last framework, they require that all researchers say how sex, gender, and or intersectional analysis works in their research if it's relevant to their research, or you have to explain why it isn't relevant. Okay, so
Exactly.
for theoretical physics, it might be not be relevant, but for many, many scientists, it
Other
is.
fields, it is. And the
So
last
that's the beginning of the research process. But at the end of the research process, um, peer-reviewed journals can require sophisticated sex, gender, and intersectional analysis when selecting papers for publication. So we've just published in Nature guidelines for quantitative intersectional research, and these guidelines should be adopted by journals. They've already adopted the SAGER guidelines, which asks for sex and gender analysis. So if sex and gender isn't in the paper, and it should be, then it's not good and it should not be published. And then the third pillar is the universities, which I already talked about.
Okay, this is really important, and as you said, European Commission already introduced the obligatory gender equality plan at the research institutions that apply for action plan that is not just on paper and to be applied in order to apply for funding through European
Yes,
programs. And this is
absolutely.
one of the really working ways to through funding to support researchers in institutions to adopt gender innovation and inclusive research practices.
Yeah, very important. I applaud the European Commission. They've done great work.
Exactly. This is a project that within which we invited you for this podcast. This is exactly a project that is devoted to improving our gender equality plans and enlarging our gender equality plans in our institutions with more intersectional actions.
Oh,
And considering data collection for this.
yes, great. Very
Okay.
important.
And thank you. And the last question, Londa, what advice would you give to early career stage researchers who want to embed equity and inclusion in their work from the start?
Yeah, so I would encourage these researchers to develop the necessary skill set. Learning how to do sex analysis, gender analysis, intersectional analysis is a set of skills. And they need to know how to do sophisticated sex, gender, and intersectional analysis if it's relevant to their work. So they won't get funded and they won't get their papers published where they want to get their papers published if they don't do this. So they can start in 2019. We published in Nature a perspective. So if you want to know how sex and gender works, if you need a place to start, obviously you can use the Gendered Innovations website, but you can also read this rather short paper, Sex and Gender Improve Science and Engineering. And that gives you a lot of tips and a lot of information. Then we've just published maybe a month ago, our Nature perspective on intersectional analysis for science and technology. And again, you can get a lot of tips there to start if you don't have it in your curriculum, and you can then move on from there. So I suggest that. I suggest using the Gendered Innovations website, and you know, it's a skill set that they have to develop, and they should do that as soon as they can.
Okay, thank you very much. And with this, we end with our today podcast, and we thanks again for your participation, Londa. Have a good day.
Yes, thank you very much.